The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as David adjusted his red wool tunic for what felt like the 100th time. At 28 years old, he had been standing guard at the palace for 3 years now, but the weight of responsibility never got easier. Every morning brought the same ritual, checking his uniform, polishing his boots until they gleamed like mirrors, and preparing his mind for hours of absolute stillness. David came from a small town, where everyone knew everyone else's business. His grandmother used to tell him stories about his great-grandfather, who had served in the war with honor and dignity. Those stories shaped David's view of service. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about representing something bigger than yourself. When he first applied to join the Guard, his friends thought he was crazy. "Why would you want to stand still all day while tourists take pictures?" they asked. But David saw it differently. He saw it as protecting history, tradition, and the values that made his country special. The training had been brutal. Months of learning to stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what happened around him. His instructors were tough but fair, teaching him that a guard's job wasn't just about looking impressive. It was about being a living symbol of strength and reliability. They taught him to ignore distractions, to keep his composure when children cried, when tourists got too close, or when someone tried to make him laugh or flinch. But nothing in his training had prepared him for some of the things he would face. On this particular Tuesday morning, the autumn air was crisp and clean. David could smell the fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixing with the scent of fallen leaves. The palace grounds were already filling with the usual crowd of tourists, school groups, and photographers. He watched them from the corner of his eye while maintaining his rigid posture. There was something peaceful about the routine, the predictable flow of people, the excited chatter of children seeing the guards for the first time, the satisfied clicks of cameras capturing memories. David had learned to read the crowd over the years. Most visitors were respectful, even reverent. They understood they were witnessing something special, a tradition that had been carried on for centuries. Families would gather for photos, keeping a respectful distance while their children whispered in amazement at the tall, still figures in their magnificent uniforms. Tour guides would explain the history and significance of the Guard, speaking in hushed, respectful tones. But David had also learned to spot the troublemakers. There were always a few in every crowd, people who saw the Guards as entertainment rather than symbols of honor. Some would try to make the Guards laugh or move by telling jokes, making faces, or doing silly dances. Others would get too close, ignoring the barriers and the clear instructions to maintain distance. Most of these incidents were harmless, just people who didn't understand the seriousness of the tradition. Then there were the truly problematic visitors. David had dealt with drunk tourists who thought it was funny to harass the Guards. He had faced people who made inappropriate comments about his appearance, his race, or his right to serve in such a position. Each time he had to dig deep into his training, remembering his grandmother's words about dignity and his instructors' lessons about representing something greater than himself. The worst part wasn't the incidents themselves. It was the feeling of helplessness that came with them. As a guard, David couldn't respond the way a normal person would. He couldn't defend himself verbally, couldn't walk away, couldn't even acknowledge that he had heard the comments. He had to stand there, absorbing whatever was thrown at him, and maintain the same perfect composure he would show to a respectful visitor. His fellow guards understood this struggle. During their breaks, they would sometimes talk about the difficult moments, sharing strategies for staying calm and focused. Some would recite poems or songs in their heads. Others would focus on breathing techniques, or think about their families and the pride they felt in their service. David often thought about his great-grandfather's stories, imagining the courage it must have taken to serve during wartime, and drawing strength from that legacy. The palace staff had always been supportive. The senior officers regularly reminded the Guards that they were valued members of the team, that their service mattered, and that any serious incidents would be dealt with appropriately. They had procedures in place for handling different types of problems, from medical emergencies to security threats to inappropriate behavior from visitors. But despite all the preparation and support, David still felt the sting of certain encounters. There were nights when he would go home and struggle to shake off the memory of someone's cruel words or hostile stare. His family would ask him about his day, and he would smile and talk about the positive interactions, the excited children, the grateful veterans who saluted him, the tourists who traveled thousands of miles just to see the changing of the guard. What kept him going was the knowledge that for every person who caused trouble, there were hundreds who genuinely appreciated what he represented. He received letters from school children who had visited the palace, thanking him for his service and asking questions about his uniform and duties. Veterans would sometimes approach during his off-duty hours to shake his hand and share their own stories of service. Foreign visitors would tell him how impressed they were with the tradition and the professionalism of the guards. David also found meaning in being part of a tradition that stretched back centuries. He was wearing the same uniform style, following the same protocols, and upholding the same standards as guards who had served before him for generations. When he put on his bearskin hat each morning, he felt connected to that long line of men and women who had stood in the same spot, faced the same challenges, and maintained the same commitment to excellence. The physical demands of the job were significant too. Standing perfectly still for extended periods required tremendous discipline and conditioning. David had developed his own routine of exercises and stretches to maintain his strength and flexibility. He had learned to position his feet just right to avoid cramping, to control his breathing to prevent dizziness, and to find a mental state that allowed him to remain alert while appearing completely still. As the morning progressed and the crowd grew larger, David noticed the usual mix of visitors. There were families with young children pointing and whispering in excitement. A group of elderly tourists was listening intently to their guide's explanation of the guard's history. Some teenagers were taking selfies while trying to get the perfect angle with a guard in the background. A few professional photographers were setting up their equipment for what looked like a planned photo shoot. David had learned to appreciate these different types of visitors. Each group brought their own energy and perspective to the experience. The children's wonder and excitement reminded him why the tradition mattered. The elderly visitors often had a deeper appreciation for the history and sacrifice represented by the guards. The photographers helped capture and share the beauty of the ceremony with people who might never have the chance to visit in person. But as he stood there, maintaining his perfect posture and scanning the crowd with his peripheral vision, David had no idea that this day would be different from all the others. He had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, he would face a test that would challenge everything he had learned about dignity, composure, and service. The morning had started like any other, but it was about to become a day that would change not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who would witness what was about to unfold. The first sign of trouble came around 11 in the morning when David noticed a man stumbling slightly as he walked through the crowd. The man was well dressed, wearing an expensive suit and shiny leather shoes, but there was something off about his movements. He was walking too deliberately, the way people do when they're trying to hide the fact that they've been drinking. David had seen this type before. Wealthy tourists who started their day with champagne at fancy hotels and thought the alcohol made them funnier or more charming than they actually were. The man appeared to be in his 50s with graying hair and a face that suggested he was used to getting his way. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from money and privilege, but there was something ugly lurking beneath the polished surface. David watched him from the corner of his eye as he moved through the crowd, noting how other visitors seemed to instinctively step aside, as if sensing something unpleasant about his presence. At first, the man seemed content to wander around with the other tourists, taking pictures with an expensive camera and occasionally checking his phone. But David noticed that his attention kept drifting back to the guards. He would stare for longer than normal, his expression growing more hostile with each passing minute. David had learned to recognize this look. It was the expression of someone who saw the guards not as symbols of honor and tradition, but as targets for their own anger and prejudice. The crowd around the palace was particularly busy that day. A large tour group from overseas had arrived, their guide explaining the history of the changing of the guard ceremony through a small megaphone. School children on a field trip were sitting in neat rows, their teacher pointing out the different aspects of the guards' uniforms and equipment. Families were spreading blankets on the grass, turning their visit into an impromptu picnic. While they waited for the ceremony to begin, David felt a familiar sense of pride watching the diverse crowd. People from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all ages coming together to witness something that represented the best of their shared heritage. There were elderly couples who had probably been visiting the palace for decades, young parents lifting their toddlers onto their shoulders for a better view, teenagers trying to look bored but secretly fascinated by the fave pageantry. But the well-dressed man was becoming increasingly agitated. David could see him muttering to himself, his face growing redder as he watched the guards. He began moving closer, pushing through the crowd with less courtesy than before. Other visitors were starting to notice him too, stepping aside more. Quickly, parents pulling their children a little closer. The man's behavior was escalating in a way that made David's training kick in. He began mentally reviewing the protocols for dealing with disruptive visitors. The first rule was always to maintain composure, no matter what happened. The second was to trust that security personnel and other officials would handle any serious situations. The third was to remember that his role was symbolic. He represented something larger than himself, and his behavior would reflect on the entire institution. David had dealt with difficult people before, but something about this man felt different. There was a focused intensity to his hostility that suggested this wasn't just a random outburst. The man seemed to be working himself up to something, building his courage or his anger to a point where he would act on whatever dark thoughts were running through his mind. The other guards had noticed the situation too. David could sense their alertness without looking directly at them. They had all been trained to work as a team, to be aware of each other's situations and ready to respond if needed. But their options were limited. They couldn't abandon their posts unless there was a direct threat, and they couldn't break character unless absolutely necessary. The man was now standing about 10 feet away from David, staring directly at him. With undisguised contempt, his expensive camera hung forgotten around his neck as he focused all his attention on the guard. David could feel the man's eyes boring into him, could sense the waves of hostility radiating from his direction. But David kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression neutral, his posture perfect. Other visitors were beginning to notice the tension. Conversations were becoming quieter, and people were starting to glance nervously between the man and the guard. A few parents had quietly moved their children to different viewing spots, sensing that something unpleasant might be about to happen. The tour guide had stopped talking and was looking around uncertainly, unsure whether to continue with her planned presentation. The man began to move closer, his steps becoming more purposeful. David could smell the alcohol on his breath now, mixed with expensive cologne and something else, the sharp scent of anger and hatred. The man's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had made some kind of decision. David's mind raced through his options. He could try to signal security with subtle eye movements, but that would mean breaking his ceremonial composure. He could attempt to de-escalate the situation by acknowledging the man somehow, but that would violate his training and the expectations of his role. His best option was to maintain his position and trust that the situation would resolve itself, or that help would arrive if needed. But the man was now close enough to touch, and his intentions were becoming clear. He leaned in close to David's face, his voice low but loud enough for nearby visitors to hear. The words that came out of his mouth were filled with such venom and hatred that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. He used language that was designed to hurt, to humiliate, to reduce David to something less than human. David felt his stomach clench as the words hit him. These weren't just random insults. They were targeted attacks based on his race, his appearance, his right to serve in his position. The man was questioning not just David's qualifications, but his very worth as a human being. Each word was like a physical blow, designed to break down David's composure and dignity. The crowd around them had gone almost completely silent. Children were looking up at their parents with confused expressions, sensing the adults' discomfort, but not understanding what was happening. The tour guide had stopped speaking entirely, her mouth hanging open in shock. Even the normally bustling sounds of the palace grounds seemed muted, as if the very air had become heavy with tension. David forced himself to breathe slowly and steadily, drawing on every technique he had learned during his training. He thought about his great-grandfather, about the dignity he had maintained even in the face of war and danger. He thought about his grandmother's stories, about the importance of representing something greater than yourself. He thought about all the people who had supported him, who believed in him, who saw him as worthy of the trust placed in him, but the man wasn't finished. He had worked himself up into a state of pure rage, and David could see in his eyes that words alone weren't going to be enough. The man was going to escalate this situation in a way that would force David to make an impossible choice between his training and his dignity, between his role as a guard and his rights as a human being. The moment that would change everything was approaching fast, and David could only stand there and wait for it to arrive. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across the world, but in that moment, time seemed to slow down to a crawl. The man's face twisted with rage as he gathered saliva in his mouth, his eyes locked on David with pure hatred. The crowd around them held their breath, sensing that something terrible was about to happen, but powerless to stop it. Children clutched their parents' hands tighter, and even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. David saw it coming. He watched the man's expression change, saw the muscles in his face tense, and knew exactly what was about to happen. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to step back, to raise his hand to protect himself. But his training held him in place like invisible chains. He was a guard, and guards didn't flinch, they didn't duck. They didn't break their composure no matter what was thrown at them. Literally or figuratively, the spit hit David's cheek with a wet, disgusting sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The crowd gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath from dozens of people who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Several people immediately started pulling out their phones, fingers fumbling with cameras as they realized they were witnessing something that would make headlines around the world. For a moment that felt like an eternity, David stood perfectly still. The saliva slowly dripped down his face, but he didn't move to wipe it away. His jaw muscles tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he was human and not a statue. Inside, his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear. His mind was racing with 1,000 different thoughts and emotions, but his body remained locked in position. The man stepped back, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He looked around at the crowd as if expecting applause or approval for what he had just done. Instead, he was met with expressions of shock, disgust, and growing anger. A woman near the front of the crowd put her hand over her mouth in horror. An elderly man shook his head in disbelief. Parents were quietly explaining to their children that what they had just seen was wrong, very wrong, but David was thinking about something else entirely. In that moment of complete humiliation, he remembered a conversation he had with his grandmother years ago. She had told him about a time when she was young and faced with someone who treated her terribly because of the color of her skin. She had two choices, she said. She could respond with anger and hatred, or she could respond with something more powerful. She chose dignity, and it changed not just her life, but the life of the person who had wronged her. David felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, burning hot in his chest, but it was being transformed into something else. Something stronger. Something that would honor not just his training, but his heritage, his family, and everyone who had ever fought for the right to be treated with respect and dignity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, David began to turn. His head, the movement was so controlled, so deliberate, that it seemed choreographed. The crowd watched in fascination as this perfectly still figure began to show signs of life. The man who had spat on him looked confused, unsure of what was happening. He had expected the guard to break, to lose his composure, to give him the satisfaction of seeing his victim crumble. When David's eyes finally met the man's, there was no anger in them. There was no hatred, no desire for revenge. Instead, there was something far more powerful, a calm, steady strength that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. The man actually took a step backward, suddenly unsure of himself. He had expected to break this guard's spirit, but instead he was facing something he hadn't anticipated. David's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. It carried across the silent courtyard with perfect clarity, reaching every person in the crowd. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "I want you to know that I serve this country and its people. All of its people. That includes you, even after what you've just done." The crowd was stunned. They had expected anger, maybe even violence. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary, a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Phones were now recording from every angle, capturing not just the words, but the incredible composure of the man speaking them. David continued, still looking directly at the man who had attacked him. "What you've done today says nothing about me or my right to serve here. It says everything about who you choose to be. And I want you to know that I forgive you for it." The man's face went white. He had prepared for many possible reactions, but forgiveness wasn't one of them. The crowd was beginning to murmur, quiet conversations spreading through the group as people tried to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about a guard and a racist tourist anymore. This was about something much bigger. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a perfectly pressed white handkerchief. The simple action seemed to mesmerize the crowd. He unfolded it carefully, his movements precise and deliberate. With the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the encounter, he dabbed at his cheek, cleaning away the spit with movements that were somehow both practical and graceful. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about for years to come, David held out the handkerchief toward the man. "You seem to have lost something important today," he said softly. "Your dignity, your sense of what's right and wrong. Maybe you'd like to clean up too, because right now, you're the one who needs it more than I do." The man stared at the offered handkerchief as if it were something dangerous. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that everyone was watching him. The crowd had shifted from shocked observers to something else. They were now looking at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. He had thought he was humiliating the guard, but instead he had humiliated himself in front of dozens of witnesses. A young mother in the crowd started clapping slowly. The sound was sharp and clear in the quiet courtyard. Soon, others joined. The applause wasn't loud or boisterous. It was respectful, almost reverent. They were clapping for David, for his grace under pressure, for his refusal to let hatred drag him down to his attacker's level. David folded the handkerchief carefully and put it back in his pocket. He straightened his shoulders and resumed his position, his eyes returning to their forward gaze. To anyone arriving at that moment, he would have looked like any other guard, perfectly still, perfectly composed, perfectly professional. But everyone who had witnessed what just happened knew they had seen something extraordinary. The man stood there for a few more seconds, looking lost and confused. The crowd had turned away from him, their attention focused on the guard who had shown them what true strength looked like. He tried to catch someone's eye, looking for support or understanding, but found only cold shoulders and disapproving stares. Finally, he turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd with none of the swagger he had shown earlier. People stepped aside to let him pass, but not out of respect, out of disgust. His expensive suit and confident manner couldn't hide what everyone had just seen. He was leaving, but his actions had been recorded by dozens of cameras, and the consequences of this moment were just beginning to unfold. Within 30 minutes of the incident, the first video had already been uploaded to social media. A teenage girl from the tour group had been recording when everything happened, and her shaky phone footage captured every second of the encounter. Her hands were trembling as she posted it with a simple caption, "I can't believe what I just saw. This guard is a hero." The video started spreading immediately. Friends shared it with friends who shared it with their friends. Within an hour, it had been viewed thousands of times. By evening, that number had grown to hundreds of thousands. People weren't just watching it once. They were watching it over and over, trying to fully understand what they had witnessed. The comment sections exploded with reactions. "I'm crying watching this," wrote one viewer. "This is what real strength looks like," said another. Veterans from around the world began sharing their own stories of facing discrimination while serving their countries. Parents showed the video to their children as an example of how to respond to bullies. Teachers started using it in their classrooms to talk about dignity and respect, but the video wasn't just spreading among ordinary people. News outlets began picking up the story. First, local news stations ran short segments about the incident. Then national broadcasters got involved. By the next morning, major international news networks were featuring the story as their lead item. The footage was being broadcast in dozens of languages across every continent. The headlines wrote themselves. Guard shows incredible grace under attack. Racism met with dignity at palace. This man's response to hatred will restore your faith in humanity. News anchors struggled to find the right words to describe what they were showing their viewers. How do you explain the power of choosing forgiveness over revenge? How do you capture the impact of responding to hatred with grace? Meanwhile, the Kiel investigation into the attacker had begun. It didn't take long for internet users to identify him. Someone recognized his face from the video and shared his name online. Within hours, people had found his social media profiles, his business information, and details about his personal life. The internet had done what it does best. It had turned one moment of poor judgment into a complete exposure of someone's entire existence. The man's name was being shared thousands of times per minute. His business was being flooded with angry phone calls and negative reviews. His social media accounts were overwhelmed with messages from people expressing their disgust at his behavior. He had gone from being an anonymous wealthy businessman to being one of the most hated people on the internet, all in the space of a few hours. His employer, a major financial firm, was quick to distance themselves from his actions. The company's CEO released a statement saying they were appalled and disgusted by the behavior of their former employee. Yes, former employee. They had fired him before the end of the business day. The statement continued, "This behavior goes against everything our company stands for. We believe in respect, dignity, and equality for all people, regardless of their background." Other consequences followed quickly. The man's country club revoked his membership. The charity boards he served on asked for his resignation. His children's private school sent a letter suggesting they might want to consider other educational options. The fancy restaurants where he was a regular customer quietly added his name to their do not serve lists. His entire comfortable, privileged world was crumbling around him. But the most significant impact was on David himself. The palace received thousands of letters and emails praising his response. Military officials from around the world sent messages of support. The royal family issued a rare public statement commending his exceptional professionalism and dignity under extremely difficult circumstances. David found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted or expected. Reporters were trying to interview him, though palace protocol prevented him from speaking to the media while on duty. Social media accounts dedicated to sharing his story appeared overnight. People were calling him a hero, a role model, an inspiration. The quiet guard who had simply tried to do his job with dignity was becoming a symbol of something much larger. The story was resonating with people because it represented something they all wished they could do. How many times had each person watching the video faced their own moments of disrespect or discrimination? How many times had they walked away wishing they had responded differently? David had shown them what the perfect response looked like. Not perfect because it was aggressive or clever, but perfect because it maintained dignity while refusing to let hatred win. International leaders began referencing the incident in their speeches. A prominent civil rights activist called it a masterclass in responding to racism with grace. Religious leaders from different faiths used the story as an example of forgiveness and turning the other cheek. University professors assigned it as required viewing in their ethics and philosophy classes. The ripple effects kept spreading. Tourism to the palace increased dramatically as people wanted to see the place where the incident had occurred. Many visitors specifically asked to take photos with David, though he continued to maintain his ceremonial duties and couldn't break character during his shifts. Still, the requests kept coming, and the palace had to issue guidelines about appropriate behavior around the guards. The story was also inspiring real change. Companies began reviewing their anti-discrimination policies. Schools started new programs about responding to bullying with dignity rather than violence. Community organizations organized workshops about conflict resolution and maintaining composure under pressure. David's response was becoming a teaching tool for positive change, but perhaps the most powerful impact was on individuals who saw themselves in David's situation. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar discrimination, saying the video had given them strength and a new way to think about responding to hatred. A young soldier wrote to say that seeing David's response had helped him deal with racism in his own unit. A teacher shared how she had used the story to help students understand the difference between weakness and strength. The man who had attacked David was experiencing the opposite trajectory. As David's star rose, his own life fell apart completely. He had lost his job, his social standing, and his reputation. Legal authorities were pursuing charges for assault and public disorder. His family was receiving threatening messages from strangers. He had become a pariah in his own community, all because of one moment of hatred that had been captured on camera and shared with the world. The contrast couldn't have been starker. David, who had been the victim of the attack, was being celebrated and honored. The man who had committed the attack was facing consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a powerful demonstration of how our choices define us, and how responding to hatred with dignity can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone who witnesses our response. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, the most surprising chapter was still to come. Because sometimes when we respond to hatred with grace, we create the possibility for something even more powerful than justice. We create the possibility for redemption. And redemption, as David was about to discover, can come from the most unexpected places. 3 weeks after the incident, David was finishing his shift when a palace official approached him with an unusual request. Someone wanted to meet with him privately, and while the official couldn't reveal the person's identity, he assured David that it was important and completely voluntary. David was curious but cautious. His life had been turned upside down by media attention, and he had learned to be careful about unexpected meetings. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday, in a small private room within the palace complex. David arrived wearing his civilian clothes, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, he was shocked to see the man who had attacked him 3 weeks earlier. But this wasn't the same arrogant, hostile person who had spat in his face. This man looked broken, defeated, and genuinely remorseful. The man's appearance had changed dramatically. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple, worn clothing. His face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. His hands shook slightly as he stood up when David entered the room. The confident businessman who had attacked a guard in front of dozens of witnesses had been replaced by someone who looked like he had lost everything. David's first instinct was to leave. Every reasonable part of his mind told him that this meeting was a bad idea. This man had humiliated him in public, had attacked him based on nothing but the color of his skin. What could he possibly have to say that would be worth hearing? But something in the man's posture, something about the way he held himself, made David pause. The man began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He explained that the past 3 weeks had been the worst of his life. He had lost his job, his friends, his social standing, and most painfully, the respect of his own children. His family was getting death threats from strangers who had seen the video. His wife had moved out, taking their kids with her. He was facing criminal charges and possible jail time, but more than the external consequences, he said, he was dealing with something much worse, the realization of what he had become. Seeing himself on that video, watching his own actions played back millions of times, had forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding his entire life. He was a racist, and that racism had turned him into someone he no longer recognized. David listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. The man continued, explaining how he had grown up in a wealthy family where certain attitudes were just accepted as normal. He had never questioned his beliefs or examined where they came from. He had surrounded himself with people who thought the same way he did, creating an echo chamber that reinforced his prejudices. The video had shattered that comfortable bubble. Suddenly, the whole world could see what he really was, and the reflection was horrifying. His own children had watched the video and asked him how he could do such a thing. His daughter, who was in college, had called him crying, saying she was ashamed to be his child. His son had refused to speak to him at all. The man broke down as he described watching the video for the first time. He had seen David's response, had heard the dignity and forgiveness in his voice, and had realized that the guard he had attacked was everything he should have been, but wasn't. David had shown strength, grace, and humanity in the face of hatred. The man had shown only weakness, ugliness, and cruelty. He explained that he had tried to contact David multiple times through official channels, not to make excuses or to ask for favors, but simply to apologize and to try to understand how someone could respond to hatred with such grace. He wanted to learn how to become a better person, how to unlearn decades of wrong thinking, how to rebuild his life on a foundation of respect rather than prejudice. David finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He told the man that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given once and then forgotten about. It was a choice that had to be made every day, sometimes every hour. He explained that his response at the palace hadn't been easy. It had taken every ounce of strength and training he possessed to maintain his composure and respond with dignity. But David also admitted something that surprised even himself. He had been thinking about the man since the incident, not with anger or desire for revenge, but with curiosity about what kind of pain or fear could make someone act with such hatred toward a complete stranger. He had wondered if the man was capable of change, if the experience might teach him something important about himself and others. The conversation lasted for over 2 hours. David talked about his own experiences with racism, about the daily challenges of representing his country while dealing with people who questioned his right to do so. He shared stories about his family, about his grandmother's teachings on dignity and forgiveness, about the choice between responding to hatred with more hatred or with something better. The man listened with growing understanding. He began to see how his actions fitted into a larger pattern of discrimination and disrespect that David and others like him faced regularly. He started to understand that his attack wasn't just a moment of poor judgment, it was part of a system of thinking that caused real harm to real people every single day. By the end of the meeting, something unexpected had happened. The man asked David if he could help him become a better person. Not for public relations, not to repair his reputation, but because he genuinely wanted to change. David was skeptical at first, but something about the man's desperation and genuine remorse convinced him that the request was sincere. David agreed to help, but with conditions. The man would have to do the hard work of examining his beliefs and changing his behavior. He would have to volunteer in communities he had previously ignored or looked down upon. He would have to listen to stories from people he had never bothered to understand before. And he would have to do all of this without expecting praise or recognition. The work itself would have to be its own reward. Over the following months, the transformation was remarkable. The man began volunteering at a community center in an underserved neighborhood, helping with after-school programs and food distribution. He attended workshops on racism and privilege, often being the only person in the room who looked like him. He read books by authors he had never heard of before, learning about experiences vastly different from his own. David would check in with him periodically, offering guidance and sometimes just listening as the man struggled with confronting his own past behavior. It wasn't easy work for either of them. There were moments when the man wanted to give up, when the weight of changing lifelong patterns of thinking seemed impossible. There were times when David questioned whether he was wasting his time trying to help someone who had attacked him so viciously. But gradually, real change began to happen. The man's children noticed the difference and slowly began rebuilding their relationship with him. His volunteer work was making a real difference in the community. Most importantly, he was developing genuine relationships with people he had previously seen as different or lesser than himself. The story reached its most powerful moment 6 months later, when both men appeared together at a community event focused on racial reconciliation. The man publicly thanked David for showing him that it was possible to respond to hatred with grace, and for giving him the chance to become someone better than he had been. David spoke about the power of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. Even in the darkest moments, their unlikely partnership became a symbol of hope for others struggling with similar issues. It showed that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome with genuine effort and the right guidance. Most importantly, it demonstrated that responding to hatred with dignity could create possibilities that no one could have imagined, including the possibility that enemies could become allies in the fight for a better world.